Corporate fraud works best in the shadows, behind corporate walls. How does the government bring these wrongdoers to justice? Whistleblowers. These are the stories of those who risk their careers to shine a light on allegations of fraud. Today on Fraud in America.
Well, welcome to today's episode of Fraud in America. This one really is one that you're going to want to listen to a few times. It is perhaps one of the most inspiring stories that you'll hear on this show. We have with us today the 2021 Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund Whistleblower of the Year, Gwang-ho Kim. We also have his daughter with us, Cindy Kim, and one of their attorneys, Wayne Lamprey, who's been in this world fighting fraud for over 25 years. But let me tell you a little bit about their end story, and then we're going to rewind, go back in time, and tell you why this case matters on so many levels. So the end of the story is that this case involves the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. On November of 2021, NHTSA announced it was paying a whistleblower reward for the very first time, and it was going to be paying a maximum reward of 30% to Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim is the former Hyundai safety engineer who reported to NHTSA in 2016 that Hyundai was failing to address a design flaw linked to its Theta 2 engines, which were prone to seizing up and even catching fire. NHTSA found that Hyundai and its Kia subsidiary had delayed recalling the vehicles, and that the Korean automaker had provided inaccurate information about the problems. In November of 2020, NHTSA issued consent orders with Hyundai and Kia. The combined penalties in the consent orders amounted to $210 million, of which $81 million was paid in cash to the United States government. The automakers also agreed to implement new safety procedures. Mr. Kim's reward for stepping forward was 30% of the $81 million he collected by the government, or $24.3 million. Those are numbers, but today we're going to get into the story. I like to pick up on this story back in 2016, if I could. You, Mr. Kim, and you, Cindy, his daughter, with your own money, bought a plane ticket from Seoul, South Korea to Washington, D.C. Why, recognizing the risk that you were taking, potentially being fired by your employer, why did you decide to make that trip?
해고는 어떻게 보면은 대한민국 내부 고발의 어떤 그런 문화였어요.
So being fired was an obvious and predictable conclusion. And if I was afraid of being fired as a result of my actions, I wouldn't have been able to do it at all. So I had already worked for 25 years at the point I decided to do this. So I think that was why I was able to have the courage to do it.
물론 메일을 통해서 NHTSA에
I could do it through email by sending NHTSA the relevant documents, but I thought it was the most effective and efficient to show the circumstances and how they have been concealing the recalls by doing it in person and by showing the documents and explaining them in person. So I asked my daughter, Cindy, and we scheduled the meeting with NHTSA officials, and we decided to go there.
이런 과정들은 제가 평소에
So I have always been a very meticulous and detailed person. So I think that was part of the reason I could do it, because I had the process ready and the documents ready to provide to NHTSA.
It's such a fabulous show of courage in stepping forward. This is a law at this time that was maybe a year old, and there certainly weren't any regulations in place to say that Mr. Kim was going to get a reward at the end of the day. Wayne, can you talk about where things stood at this time when he reached out?
Sure, I'm happy to, Jeb, and I want to back us up a little bit too with some of the events at Hyundai that prompted Mr. Kim's travels, him and his daughter. The predicate was that Hyundai had redesigned an engine used in many, many of its vehicles, millions of vehicles. And it had increased the power of that engine increasing the load on the parts in that engine, but it had failed to beef up some of the very basic engine components. And at a point when already millions of vehicles with this engine had been sold, they started to fail in the field out in different countries where they were. And Mr. Kim had been the lead on the engineering team at Hyundai to try to figure out what is going on. And they concluded that the problem was a design defect. And that was hugely significant because it meant that Hyundai didn't have something that was isolated where, for 1 week or 1 month, somebody at a plant had done something wrong. But it meant that all of the engines built to that design had this problem. They also concluded internally that it was a safety issue because the engines could seize up while you're driving down the freeway. And maybe the engine would blow up and even catch fire. So they knew they had to report this to the U.S. Department of Transportation as a safety defect. And they said, we got to figure out how much this is going to cost. And again, Mr. Kim participated in that calculation, and the cost was in the billions of dollars for the U.S. alone. And the company wasn't willing to do that. Mr. Kim, he had heard of, at that point in time, the Motor Vehicle Safety Whistleblower Act. And he knew not too much about it. And he actually spoke with somebody at DOT about whether he was protected by it. He did not receive robust assurances because he was in South Korea. And this was a new statute, as you say, with no regulations, that nobody knew how it was going to work. But I think the key thing there is right at the outset, the first time anybody's gone in under this statute, you see its international reach. And that's what the auto industry is now. It's international. And I think it was a combination of he was going to do it anyway because he knew it was the right thing. He'd already been transferred and he knew he might lose his job there. So he's that kind of person. Plus, he had confidence, frankly, in the U.S. government that the U.S. government would do the right thing and support him and back him up, even though they didn't have regs at that point.
Thank you for that, Wayne. That was very helpful in understanding the story. This culture of deciding at some point that they're not going to disclose. Mr. Kim, at this time, you'd been there for over 20 years. Were you surprised that they decided to not disclose and to try to paint this as something small?
2015년도 7월달, 8월달에 셔다 2 엔진을
So in July 2015, an internal TFT team had meetings regarding how to report these problems to NHTSA. And what I felt about it was that Hyundai had been almost always downplaying and trying to minimize the problems and issues they had with their engines and other problems with the cars. And I had just joined the team, the quality management team, for 5 months when that happened. So what I saw going on, it really shocked me how they were just regularly violating these laws, not just inside Korea, but outside in the US as well.
대표적인 수치로 이야기할 수 있는 게
A representative statistics is that Hyundai had been recalling cars in Korea, and for about 12 years, there were about 570,000 recalls. But after 2017, until this year, on average, 2.5 million cars have been recalled. So this shows that the change in recall after I blew the whistle and how many problems in car recalls have been minimized before I did the whistleblowing.
Wow. That speaks volumes. So this engine, they started using in 2009. So there's a lot of cars out there that had this engine that was defective. In March of 2017, there was a recall, right? They started recalling at a higher level, but they seem to be, again, downplaying it. So when they announced these recalls in March of 2017, and really trying to limit the impact of those recalls, what were your thoughts at that time?
The thing I wanted to note for you is that prior to the date you've just asked about, and he's told you, the fraud here was one of silence. Hyundai had decided, we're just not going to tell the Department of Transportation as we are required to. When cars started to fail, though, in the United States, this sort of thing is reported through the dealerships, and they are required and do report to DOT. And DOT will then start to notice a pattern and can open an investigation. Hyundai was ready for that. And now this entered a new phase because the scheme that had been developed of first, don't tell, and then two, if we're ever asked, lie about it. Now we got to the lie about it part because they had a cover story ready to go.
Yeah, this is a great reminder for people. A lot of times we hear folks from the other side call everything in this world a tips program, right? You submit a tip and then the government goes on and does the investigation. And at the end of the day, there's this reward that's paid to that tipster. But that's not the reality, right? This is Mr. Kim deciphered and translated what was actually happening behind closed doors, these half-truths or complete lies that were coming out, and letting them know, they may say this is what's happening, but here's the reality. And that's such a key role that whistleblowers play, right, Wayne? This deciphering and letting them know, here's the reality of what you're not hearing from the defendant.
Yeah, and if I can build on that point here.
Yeah.
Mr. Kim and Cindy, initially and in follow-up visits, they came with just sizzling evidence. The internal records developed in South Korea of what's the real cause, how many vehicles are involved, projecting how many are going to fail, even the documents about what's our cover story going to be. And that evidence never would have made its way to DOT but for Mr. Kim and his daughter and their bravery, and frankly, the whistleblower program too. Hyundai is the second largest corporation in South Korea, and they have tremendous power and sway there in many ways. And even I, as an American lawyer who went to visit, meet, spent a few weeks and days there, I had some trepidation getting on and off the plane with what I knew I had in my briefcase at times. And Hyundai was already under a consent decree when this occurred from a prior problem. And so do you think those records would have made their way here without Mr. Kim bringing some and then some of us who were his counsel bringing them too? I don't think that would have happened. And that's just one of the remarkable powers of the whistleblower statute. And frankly, the bravery of our client.
Wow. So, Cindy, I have to ask you, and I'm a father of a daughter, so I'm putting myself in Mr. Kim's shoes here. What did you think when you boarded that plane in 2016, knowing that you were going to be traveling the other side of the world to help your father disclose this?
Well, I was also a bit quite worried and afraid, like what's going to happen after this. So, because like Hyundai is such a big company and is like tremendous amount of power in Korea. So I was just really scared for his life and like the impact that it was going to have to our family, and not just to him. But I already, made the decision to really support him and be there for him. And I had the ability to help him because he through his, support and his financial support, like I had the ability to speak English and I was able to translate for him. So I think it was just obvious and it was my role to do it because I acquired these abilities thanks to him. So, yes.
Wow. So Hyundai, of course, retaliated against Mr. Kim, right, Wayne? Can you talk about some of the things that they did to retaliate against him?
Sure. Well, it started with when internally at Hyundai, he protested within his unit or the group he worked with. He was immediately reassigned. Then he went to sort of a compliance group and to, again, say, I think we're not doing this properly and what we should be doing. And that group as well was frankly, seems, looking at it from the outside, a little bit worried and intimidated and told him, well, That was your prior manager's decision. You'll have to take it up with him. So even within the company, the group that's charged with making sure they're complying with the law that you're supposed to go to, they didn't feel they had the safety, the support, the wherewithal to take actions. And then after he came to the US and what he had done became public, he was then fired with only a short time to go before his pension of 20 some years would have vested. And they sued him civilly for breach of trade secrets and company confidentiality. And in a feature that's a little bit different in Korea than in the US, a company can file a criminal complaint. And then if it's judged to have a certain credibility, the police will investigate it and might prosecute it. Search warrants were executed on Mr. Kim's home, I think twice. And some of this straddles him coming to the US. And part of what we did was to, help him secure counsel in Korea to deal with those things. And the criminal prosecution eventually ended. He reached a settlement with Hyundai with respect to his pension and termination. And he was left alone, and there was a tense truce to this day between him and Hyundai.
Wow. I don't know. I've been around this world involving whistleblowers for 20 years, and I don't know if I've ever seen someone go through the ringer like that. That's truly remarkable. Mr. Kim, in November of 2020, it was announced that Hyundai were going to have to pay a large sum. They entered into consent orders, and they were going to have to not only write a big check, but actually try to right the wrong here. What was your thought at that time? Did you feel vindicated when that happened? What were your thoughts?
나오는데 시간이 상당히 많이 걸렸습니다.
It took a really long time until that news was announced in 2020, November. And it was around 4 years and 6 months after I made the report to NHTSA personally. So it was a really long and tiring process of waiting for all of us. And I was relieved that it was finally over and that my whistleblowing was successful.
네, 그런데 그때 이제 로이터 통신을 통해서
In the settlement agreement that Hyundai and Kia signed, they never admitted the recall concealment. And in the agreement, it said that they are signing the agreement just to settle the case, basically. And in November 2020, in this entire process, they never admitted or agree with what the NHTSA had found out about their actions.
And that's unfortunately very common. But one of the things I have to highlight here, and it's really important, is that, they didn't just write a check, right? They had to recall millions of cars. They had to put money on the line to improve things going forward. There was a monitor put in place. Do you have some level of satisfaction in knowing the lasting impact that you made beyond just the dollar amounts?
그런데
Back then, even when that news was announced, the recalls that Hyundai and Kia agreed to do were not really done fully. And the way that they recalled the cars was not appropriate. And it also did not cover the entire amount of cars. So I didn't understand how and why they reached such an agreement between them.
Wayne, do you have any thoughts on this part?
It often takes a long time. The other thing is the international aspect of this. And frankly, the audacity of it made it also more of a challenge. Mind you, Hyundai came in with a ready story about problems at a specific plant. And Mr. Kim was saying, that's just not true. It's this design defect. And if you're a government counsel and you're being met by, respectable counsel from a respectable firm that's been told by their client that's the problem, that's a pretty big difference. And it's a little hard to just accept right up that this man who flew in from South Korea with his daughter is telling you the truth. And I think it was quite a challenge for them to sort through that. But they'd met their match with Mr. Kim, or, he really had the goods. And I guess I also want to highlight that the whistleblower program and allowed Mr. Kim to obtain counsel, us, at Constantine Cannon, and it allowed us then and the possibility of an award to him and payment for our work to do a lot of legwork, flying back and forth to Korea, getting experts, translating documents, helping the agency sort of multiplying its investigative powers to sort through this. And that's another really important aspect of what these statutes provide.
Yes, a true David versus Goliath story. But the interesting thing here, I think you put your finger right on it, Wayne, is this being able to leverage the resources to supplement the limited resources of the government really makes the programs work. This program, however, had a wrinkle to it, right? You're operating under a hope and a wish and a belief that they were going to ultimately pay your client. So then, all this money was paid out, consent orders were signed, and then it came time to hopefully pay your client, and nothing seemed to happen. And finally, there was this Wall Street Journal article that came out on April 4th of 2021 titled "Whistleblower Program for Auto Safety Has Yet to Launch Years After Congress Mandated," and it highlights Mr. Kim's struggles in receiving a reward. During this time, Wayne, what do you think was going to play out here?
Well, maybe it was our turn to be a little naive when the statute passed and it said regulations were to be promulgated. I think it was in a year. I can't quite remember. But it did not proceed at that pace under the prior administration. The Wall Street Journal article and communications from two senators who had played a role in passing the statute, expressing their displeasure at the pace, that was welcome. There's no doubt about it from our point of view. And we were, of course, in contact with DOT and with existing counsel there and new leadership, and got quick assurances that, they really were going to take this seriously. And, I will say that in terms of the investigative effort and our work with the staff, investigators, and counsel, they were working hard on the investigation. But a whistleblower program was a whole new thing to them. And I know, Jeb, that you and I have seen it and others have. Some agencies embrace it and understand how much help we can be, and other agencies see us as meddlers. But it's a learning experience for the agency too. And hope and prayer. Yeah, we knew we were going into a new area, but saw it as one in terms of the size of the industry and what goes on in it as one of great potential and really need for it. And the more we've worked in it, I would say, there's a fair amount of non-reporting and efforts by automakers and part suppliers to avoid recalls. There's terms like silent recalls and other such things are well known in the industry. And we're very proud, obviously, to have represented Mr. Kim, to have obtained this result, and of the work the agency's done in our relationship with the agency at this point.
As we said at the top of the show, ultimately the Department of Transportation and NHTSA did the right thing and rewarded Mr. Kim with the 30% whistleblower reward here. Mr. Kim, likely there's somebody else listening to this show today who's in your shoes where you were in 2015 and 2016. What would you say to that person today?
국내에서도 인터뷰하면서 그런 얘기를 많이 듣는데요.
So I have been asked this question a lot in Korea as well. So what I think is that it is really a hard and toiling process, just being a whistleblower. And so I would like to tell a potential whistleblower that they should try hard, not just to report a problem, but try to make a successful whistleblowing experience. I think the most important thing is that I had internally reported this problem in the company, and I have given enough chance to redress and make this problem right. So some people say that I did this just because of the reward or the money, but obviously when I when I started it, I had internally reported it to the company, and I had been waiting for almost 1 year for the company to make some action or response to what I reported internally. So when I tell those people who think that I did this for the money, when I tell them these stories, they admit and they know that I did it for a reason, for justice, and not just for the money.
그리고 챕터 2 엔진에
So for Theta 2 alone, I was the person who managed this engine recalls, and so I was able to have a lot of relevant documents and information about this. So it wasn't like I tried to collect these information or documents to do the whistleblowing, but it was a natural and just natural course and a result for me to have these documents because it was my work and I was a manager.
네, 그 당시에 셔터 2 엔진 관련해서
Many people in the company back then knew about this problem, like maybe 20 or 30 something, but none of them thought that the circumstances were problematic, and they rather did what the company told them to do just as employees, and they seemed like they didn't even care or thought it was a problem. So, but what I thought was different, and I thought we needed the courage to make it right and tell the company that they're doing something wrong.
그리고 제가 공익 제보를 하려고 결정하고 나서
After I decided to do the whistleblowing, the first thing I did was to persuade my family. So I couldn't really do anything related to it without my family's agreement and support, because it was going to be a really long fight against a multi-billion-dollar company. So and the reward measures in place in the Whistleblowing Act were one of the reasons I could really take the courage and really do it.
그리고 마지막으로
So finally, I had been working at Hyundai almost like 25 years in a good working condition, and I was paid really good money. But the conclusion I made in the end was that the reason I could make a good life out of working for this big company was not because that Hyundai paid me these salaries, but it was because the customers bought the cars relying on us. And as an engineer, I really just couldn't pretend that nothing was going on, and that I really had to take the courage to show the customers that the Hyundai is really not doing a good job at, protecting their customers.
What a story. My good friend Wayne, Cindy, Mr. Kim, I really appreciate you taking time to speak with us. I just wanted to acknowledge the exceptional courage you showed, Mr. Kim, in coming forward to protect the American motorists from safety risk posed by these defective engines. Who knows how many lives you possibly saved? Certainly, the amount of potential harm that these engines could have caused is one that one probably doesn't even want to think about. I just really appreciate you stepping forward for everybody's safety. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeb, for the interest and for the organization's recognition of Mr. Kim and what he did.
Absolutely. Well, you'll want to join us next week when we go in a little bit of a different direction on the next episode of Fraud in America. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Fraud in America. Today's episode was made possible because of the generous donation of longtime TAF supporter and whistleblower attorney David L. Herron. If you believe you have witnessed fraud against the government or fraud on the financial markets, we encourage you to visit our website at taf.org, where you will find a directory of member attorneys who represent whistleblowers across the country. On our website, you will also find additional information about our nation's various whistleblower laws and programs, and a way to donate to our organization as we step forward in spreading information about whistleblower programs. This episode was edited and produced by Rachel Brooks, and our theme song is by Connor Chaos. A big thank you to our TAF staff and researchers of James King, Emma Bass, Jackie DeMar, Kate Scanlon, Max Boldman. Fraud in America is a project of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. The opinions expressed on today's show belong solely to the guest and are not necessarily endorsed by the organization. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Fraud in America.